Hi, everyone. This is another IoT Tech Talk. I'm Stefan. I'm an IoT developer, ecosystem manager. And as normal for the Tech Talk, I invited, or sometimes I invite some guests. Today, I have also invited some guests in this Tech Talk. To the topic we will speak about is web app integration tests. And I have invited Christian Güther and Thomas Winkler, but maybe Christian, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stefan. So my name is Christian Güther. I'm working for Cumulocity Professional Services, meaning that I will implement customer projects. And my role is basically a solution architect, but also a full stack developer. This means that I can implement microservices, but also at the same time web apps based on the Cumulocity SDK. Over to you, Thomas.
Yeah, hi Stefan, hi Christian. So my name is Thomas, and I'm an R&D lead in Cumulocity IoT. My team is basically working on DTM, but also OEE application, sensor apps, so different topics. And I'm here today, thank you, Stefan, as I started a project for sharing a test framework that we are using internally. And me and my team are basically working on.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Christian. Especially you, Christian, you had some, I would say, project experience in web development for Cumulocity IoT. You also posted in the past some articles how to get started with web development. And recently you also published an article about end-to-end tests for web applications, which also will be the topic of today. But maybe we start with what's your background in web development? And I can start myself. I would see myself as I would say, more like a backend developer. I have some experience in web development. I know Angular, I can write some plugins, but I always stopped at the testing part. You know, I know that there's some tests needed. I know that also that there's some framework needed. And I also implemented some tests by myself, but I'm not so deep into the whole testing part. This is mainly why I brought you. So I roughly can understand it. And I think this is a good background to ask you some questions that I can understand it more better in this call. But maybe you can give a little bit feedback about your background in web development, Christian.
Yeah, sure. So honestly, I'm also mainly a backend guy. So originally I started as a mobile app developer when I first started at Software AG, so did a lot of Android applications. Then there was also kind of an internal web app project. So this was actually my first contact with web app development, but this was based on JSF, so Java Server Faces. So I don't recommend to use this kind of framework because it's really annoying. And once I started with Cumulocity or became a Cumulocity consultant, I started with microservice development, but also in parallel with web app development for Cumulocity. At this time, it was still using AngularJS and not Angular. So this is something which Cumulocity, I think, changed 4 years ago. So initially, all web apps were implemented in AngularJS, and now they moved over to support Angular. And yeah, that's actually why when I also started implementing AngularJS application, or later on also Angular web apps for customers.
And because you were just interested, or you had some projects to do that, or what was the background?
Both. So okay. Also had some side projects then implemented in Angular, but of course then also for the customer projects we then used Cumulocity's web SDK in order to implement the requirements of the customers in a web app based on the latest Cumulocity tech stack. And yeah, that's more or less the background I have for web app development.
Yeah, but you evolved very well, I would say. Yeah, because you're doing it regularly, you have quite a lot of knowledge in that area.
Yeah, the concepts which you encounter, especially in Angular, are quite similar to mobile app development, honestly. So the whole patterns, model view controller, which you have in mobile app development, are also there in Angular. So it's just a different programming language now with TypeScript, but also TypeScript now as a type language also shares similarities with Java or Kotlin in Android development. So there's not that much of a difference. So it's not that hard to get into web development based on Angular if you have, at least for me, a background in mobile app development and coming from Android.
For me, it was actually pretty tough. I can remember a project myself. I was evaluating different UI frameworks, and I started. Do you know Vardin? Vardin is another. I think it's a Java framework where you can write Java and it will generate you some front ends out of the box, more like for formulas and stuff. But it's also involved. And I compared them with a new technology which was Angular at that time. And I was really struggling with Angular, but I had a very high learning curve learning that. But in the end, once you have reached the point that you understand how flexible and how amazing UIs you can build with Angular in comparison to if you just stick to Java and generate some stuff with some other frameworks, this was quite amazing in the end. This was my lessons learned, and I then invested in some trainings in Angular and so on. But what about?
I think it's also because the learning curve for Angular is quite high, because it already forces you to use some patterns like the separation between data model and services, which is actually
also
good.
Changing very rapidly. So you maybe you have learned Angular JS and now you want to dig in Angular, and then everything is different now. But But what about you, Thomas? What's your background in web app development?
Yeah, it's basically similar to what Christian shared already. So I'm also coming, like most front-end experience I have is actually also mobile development. So, but myself more coming from an iOS side. So done years and years of Mac and iOS development. Quite some time ago actually, and we're still also working on some iOS components for Cumulocities in the web, for example. But it's just a very small part of what we're doing actually. And but to be honest, I mean, we're working on a few components that have UI like DTM and also OEE. But if we talk about testing, it doesn't really matter what framework is used, especially if you use like E2E testing. The framework itself doesn't really matter, as we look at the application from the outside and what it appears to me as a user, and not how it's implemented. So that's why I found it's not even a problem or disadvantage not to have like years and years of Angular experience in order to actually write some tests. So that was a nice learning. So we've done a lot of testing also for mobile applications. For example, we've used Appium in a company I used to work for. We also did actually come up with our own web-based test framework that's now called, I think, Web2Test by a company called QF Test. So I have some ideas, and I know the challenges, and that's why I actually so much appreciate Cypress, also from coming from this background, because it was like really easy to learn, also really easy to work with, even if you don't have a lot of Angular experience. So I would agree to what Christian said. So TypeScript makes it really easy. If you come like from different technologies, like even from iOS or Java, or TypeScript was the second part that made it really easy to come up with something like this. I mean, it's not always easy, but especially here, it has a lot of advantages.
Okay, but before we start into talking about technologies and so on, let's make one step back, and because I think everybody who's seeing this and watching this might not be so experienced in end-to-end tests, but might have just developed a web app. Let's start with a simple question. What is, in your opinion, is the need to have end-to-end tests? Yeah, if you, for example, just started your first web app for Cumulocity, or you wrote a plugin, you're most probably saying, okay, I tried it out for myself. I forget about testing. But if you're now running into a project, why is there a need to have end-to-end tests?
Yeah, I think the main reason is you want to deliver a product to the customer which has high quality. So it's best without any bugs, but this is, in my opinion, impossible. So you will always have some kind of bugs. But you want to have, or you want to deliver a state of the application to the customer which is nearly perfect, so that you don't want to get in a situation that you deploy an application which is then used by a customer or users, and that users then actually report back bugs to you, which maybe then could have been easily found before if you would probably test your application. So I think the easiest way of testing your application is manual testing. That if you have to develop your application, that you then run your application and click through your application, but and that you maybe beforehand have defined your test cases. But this is something you would then need to do every time you want to deploy a new feature. Then you would have to run through your test case again and again and again. This is really time consuming, of course, and also cost consuming. And I think this is also one of the reasons why you actually want to implement end-to-end tests, because these end-to-end tests can then execute it automatically and applying the same workflows which you normally would do manually, so that you don't need to run these tests manually. And then with these end-to-end tests, if these tests then test your application, you could also then integrate these into your CI/CD pipeline and have a full life cycle from developing a new feature, pushing it to your repository, then have your pipelines running on the repository which execute end-to-end tests, test a new feature, but also test the existing feature if everything still works as intended. And then once the tests have been successful, then we'll deploy it to production. So I think this is the main workflow in order to improve product quality, meaning that you encounter bugs as early as possible and not after you have deployed the application. And therefore also reduce basically development costs, because tests are executed automatically. No one needs to test them manually, because it's also where you would need to have some kind of external resource. Someone has to do it manually, and this also costs, of course. And then you have also always the human error, so that you maybe test something wrong, maybe forget some test cases. And this basically can't happen with end-to-end tests, which are executed automatically.
Is this also a question of complexity? As we say, if you just have a web page, have just an image and then a button, okay, it's pretty simple to test, of course. But if I have a very complex, there's a lot of fields with a lot of options, with a lot of things I can click on. Is this also something which would you say, here I need to have end-to-end tests, or would you say it doesn't matter? I always need to have, if I want to deploy it to a productive environment, I always need to have, I should have an end-to-end test in the end.
Yeah, as you said, so it depends a bit. So I think simple parts can also be covered by a unit test.
Yeah, okay, sure.
So you could implement also component unit tests. So there's also a blurry line between component unit tests and end-to-end tests, because some things which you test in end-to-end tests could potentially also be covered by unit tests. So
yeah, but you do not have the outer scope, I would say.
Yeah, you don't have the outer scope. So for example, especially if you have communication between components, intercommunication between components, then of course you always have to use end-to-end tests. And especially if you also want to test how components work together with services. Are the correct requests being sent out to your backend? So this is something you then can probably test with end-to-end test. And even this, especially this kind of topic, if you want to test, so like you said, you have a form, you want to test if the form successfully then sends correct data to the backend. And this is something which you can then easily test with end-to-end test, because you see, okay, what kind of request has been sent? This is correct endpoint which has been requested, and the payload has the correct structure. So this is quite easy then to test with end-to-end test. So I think if you have the capacities, the resources, you should always implement end-to-end tests. Because yeah, as mentioned, so this is always also coming from professional services or as a consultant, if you implement customer projects.
Yeah, sure.
Testing is sometimes not the highest priority. It's more like, okay, deliver a feature as fast as possible and with the lowest cost as possible. And then if you start, yeah, but what about testing? We need to implement end-to-end tests. Yeah. Focus on the feature first. So this is also
but
kind of a trade-off.
Sometimes it coming back to you, right? And then you need to implement.
Yeah, I think also now customers more and more understand that testing is also a crucial part of the overall project delivery. And I think also how it developed over the last year, especially now with CI/CD integration, it's now also easier to run end-to-end tests as part of the CI/CD pipelines.
Okay. I think, or I know that there are some technology and frameworks out there that makes the life of the web app developer easier. In regards of Cumulocity and Angular, what kind of tools and framework would you suggest to use? I think, Thomas, you already mentioned you pressed by Cypress. What else do you know and could be an alternative or could be an option to use for a web developer to implement end-to-end tests?
Yeah, maybe I can start answering this one. So we had a project where we didn't use Cypress from the beginning, but instead Playwright. So it's also an end-to-end testing framework similar to Cypress. Also, the overall concept and principle is really similar to Cypress. So I think I'm not sure why we originally have chosen Playwright instead of Cypress. I think there were some cool extensions for Visual Studio Code, which simplified the process to create tests. I think there was coming of a recorder tool that you basically opened the application and then recorded your workflow. And out of this recording, the extension would generate a Playwright test for you. So it was a bit easier compared. I'm not sure if something similar exists for Cypress, but it made it quite easy to come up with an initial test for Playwright, especially because you would need to implement selectors, what kind of component you want to select in order. For example, if you have a button, you first need to select the button via a DOM selector. This sometimes can be a bit difficult if you haven't set up your application properly. And I think there the recorder for Playwright comes in handy. But the same project, we then changed from Playwright to Cypress. And the main motivation here was that we learned that R&D has already been working on or is using Cypress internally for their end-to-end tests.
Can you shortly explain what Cypress is for people who doesn't know?
Yeah, so Cypress is an end-to-end testing framework, which allows not only to do end-to-end tests, but also component testing. So this is, I think, also something which we will discuss a bit later.
Is it dedicated to some programming language? Is it only for Angular, or is it for open to any web programming language?
It's not restricted to any framework. So it's just basically that you run your application and then Cypress opens the application in the browser. And it's kind of how you would test your application. So you define the test scenario, define the steps. Okay, I have here a form, so I open the form, I fill in the different fields, and then I click on submit. And to Cypress,
so totally independent from what you have used to develop your website.
Exactly. You can use Angular, you can use React, you can use Vue, you can also do vanilla JavaScript. It doesn't matter. So therefore, Cypress is fully independent from the framework you develop your application, because it simply just opens. So for example, if you run Cypress in the open mode, it starts your application in the browser and then basically uses the workflow which you have defined in order to test your application. But in the end, it's totally independent. And coming back to your original question, so we have chosen Cypress because R&D, we learned that R&D is using Cypress, and that R&D has also developed its own package to collect different kind of comments. because if you start a Cypress test, and this is also something I can show later, you have a lot of, let's say, boilerplate code or stuff which you need to do in order to run your test. So, for example, in the context of Cumulocity, if you start your Cumulocity application in the browser, you first have to, or you are basically greeted by a login dialog, and you first have to fill out your credentials in order to sign into Cumulocity. And this is something which you would need to implement in every project again and again, this whole process that you create a session. Because in order for Cypress to test Cumulocity applications, it also needs to have a valid session in order to access Cumulocity functionality, like opening a dashboard for a device or for a group. And then, additional features, which also Thomas will, I guess, highlight a bit later, like basic functionality which you encounter regularly. So this is all part of the Cypress package. So you don't have to code it every time again and again. So this basically accelerates you when you implement your Cypress end-to-end test, because you can rely on these implemented comments and don't need to care about how I need to, what do I need to implement in order to create a valid session. So this is something you can directly take from the package which Thomas and team have implemented, and solely focus on your test. So what you specifically want to test.
Okay, that's an interesting point. So to summarize that, we have Cypress for the end-to-end integration testing, and for the common steps, you mentioned that there's a package which has developed by your team, Thomas. You already mentioned some parts, but Thomas, can you highlight what is the package actually doing? What is the package for? Why you have developed that?
Yeah, maybe first of all, just to come back to your previous question. So even Angular did come with its own testing framework, right? It's still called Protractor. Yeah. But Angular, I think a couple of years ago, they announced to discontinue Protractor, and they actually, what they suggested was Cypress and I think Nightwatch and WebDriver IO, so things like this, which they specifically set to add some support into Cypress. So that's why also Cumulocity R&D started using Cypress, moving from Protractor into a new framework as it's discontinued, not supported. And that was when we actually started looking into Cypress. What I personally like about Cypress, and that's also something you always need to decide when you choose a testing framework, especially if you want to do web testing, is how do you want to control the browser? Because somehow you need to interact with the application. Somehow you need to interact with the DOM, with the elements, and you need to record, you need to take screenshots, videos, you have to type data into input fields, etc. Right? So you want to catch events. And there's basically, at least, two different approaches. So the old approach typically was a WebDriver based approach, so controlling the browser from the outside. So basically everything we know from Selenium, for example, and I think also Protractor was Selenium based. But this always has at least people basically, like everyone basically considers this kind of testing more or less as flaky. And this is, I guess Christian can agree. So if you build huge test suites and you invest a lot of time in testing and test automation, flakiness is something that really kills it, because, if a test succeeds but sometimes fails, and then all your build fails and everything, this is really something you want to avoid. And this is also something I really like about Cypress, even though, I mean, I'm not saying this is like the best or the right approach, but I personally like it. So Cypress is actually running inside the browser where your application is running in. So it has direct access to the DOM of the application. And in fact, if you, for example, click a button or you click a link in your web application, it's not really doing a click, like if you would use WebDriver from the outside, it would just trigger an event on the DOM, right? And that's then a choice you have to make. Is it okay for you, or is it not okay? I think there are some companies who say no, it's not okay because it's not like a real click. But yeah, so I think for what we are doing, this is perfectly fine. Yeah, and this comes with a lot of advantages, right? So that it's really easy to interact with the application, to get the state of the application, to change the state of the application, also to intercept mock stub requests, so those kind of things. This is really something that I like about Cypress. Also, it comes with some integrated wait functionality, so you don't always have to add explicit waits. I click and then I wait for something to happen, or I wait like 10 seconds or something, and then I do the next action. So this is something that works implicitly in Cypress. I mean, you can do explicit waits, but it's actually not required. And it's maybe even a best practice. As soon as you hit the need for adding an explicit wait, you have to think about it. You're doing probably something wrong, or you should reconsider what you're doing. So that's why we basically chose Cypress and built a lot of test automation on top of Cypress, especially also for all our components. But then we found, and that's another advantage of Cypress, it's easily extendable. So it's actually just a Node.js based. It comes as an npm package. You just say npm install Cypress and you're done. So this is basically what you can do everywhere. Yeah. Also just to prepare some Docker infrastructure for your CI/CD. And this is also a huge advantage to some other, big test tools and studios. If you have like a Windows-based test tooling, you have different challenges making it work in CI/CD than just installing an npm package and run, right? So it's very easy. But as Christian mentioned, so we ran into the situation to extend Cypress in order to not do all the same things over and over again. If we visit a page, we want to make sure it uses a certain language and the cookie banner doesn't come up, and all this kind of stuff. And soon you start creating custom commands like hide cookie banner because we don't care about the cookie banner. Or we want to log in without actually, going through some login dialog, but maybe using REST API to log in and to get to the page without login to save time, etc. And then you start creating custom commands for this, which is a great feature of Cypress. You can just extend the API that Cypress is providing very easily. And at some point, then you start, okay, now we have tests for component A, and now we want to write tests for component B. How do I get the commands that I created for component A into component B? So I don't have to just copy some code, and all of a sudden you start working on a package like the Cumulocity Cypress package, which I started.
You stumbled into it. So.
I started at the very beginning, actually, just to share commands and to share the work we've been doing across different projects and across different products. And it has grown quite a lot, but this was the initial idea. And that's also a best practice I would actually give. Not just, copy code and really make sure, to make the code similar to what you would use your production code for, your product code for, implement, maintain it, support it in a way as you would support your product, and then you come to such a package like Cumulocity Cypress.
That's an interesting point, because you mentioned that you have started it internally, but now you also publish it open source. Is this correct? So everybody can actually use it.
Everybody can use it. Yeah, it's in Software AG organization in the public GitHub, and you can also just run npm install Cumulocity Cypress, and you have it, you can use it.
Yeah, I think we kind of forced Thomas to publish it as professional services.
So there have been some requests.
To actually, not copying code and do something in a new package, but hesitated to publish it open source. Okay.
Yeah, because before it was basically internally.
Yeah.
Only, and we can't use internal stuff in customer projects, especially if the project is hosted on customer's environment infrastructure. And there we had the need actually that R&D provides this package also as open source or as an NPM package basically, so that we can also use it in customer projects. Otherwise, we would still be stuck in the situation that we have to develop our own comments. And this is also something which Thomas already touched. So even if you develop your own comments, it could be that your comments have some bugs in it, so that actually then your tests fail because wrong because your comments have bugs in it. And this is also an advantage of the package of Thomas, because all the comments which have been developed as part of the package are having their own tests to check whether the comments are working properly. And this is also why we wanted to use this package instead of having our own comments, for which we then would also have to come up with some tests or at least test them properly to make sure that they are working as expected.
And that's something very important, and that's very important for me because, you can just easily write a custom command in Cypress. You just, do whatever you want in the command and you run it in your E2E suite. But if your E2E suite fails, you don't know why, right? So it might just fail in your custom command, and you don't have any idea why it fails or why it sometimes fails and not always. And just maybe for certain data and not for all data. And so that's why I really recommend, and that's why I then also set up the repository, so I can really have some sort of a playground or some workspace where you not just, share some code, but also apply the same principles you would do for your product code. Yeah, you write some tests, you write some documentation. And I can really recommend everyone, just if you work on custom commands, just maybe use maybe as a best practice what we did for Cumulocity Cypress, and write your tests for your test code basically. And it's so much improved the quality and reliability also of our test. This is you wouldn't even think, right? So just maybe giving one brief example, we did have, I think it was last September, most of our teams in Cumulocity did have problems with their tests because the Angular locale, and I think the Angular English locale was different than the locale in most other date parsing frameworks like Moment.js, Date.js, Date.fns, etc. I think in Angular they said sept with the trailing T, and all other locales didn't have the trailing T. So all of a sudden, tests doing date parsing kind of like failed because of the trailing T, and no one really knew why, right? And based on the framework, I created a custom command, which basically is called toDate, and it just takes a string from your, you can point it at any element in your DOM, and it will just convert it into a date, as long as the date is formatted using the seed-wide date pipe in the Angular seed-wide date pipe, and it will automatically do everything for you. And I could create a whole test suite and testing all different kinds of, locale conversions. That actually our code was the only one not failing, right? And this was then also achieved because we're actually translating the Angular locale into a Date.fns locale to do the whole comparison stuff. So that's why it worked. I'm quite technical now. I'm just saying that, or the reason I'm highlighting this is because it sounds easy, right, to transform a date string into a date, but at the end we were talking about probably 1,000 lines of code here just to make this work for all cases. And if you don't have tests you will never know why your tests fail, right? So really consider it more part of your product and have the same product principles, and then you really need some playground where you can develop your test commands. You can debug it, you can document it, you can test it, and that's very important. And that's actually one of the main reasons why I personally like working on this. Yeah.
Okay. Now we talked a lot about Cypress, end-to-end testing, and so on, but I think it's time that we have a look on example. I know that you, Christian, wrote an article, and you also had an example project, I guess, where you can give us maybe some, I would say, basic example how such an end-to-end test actually looks like. This would be awesome.
Yeah. So let me share my screen, and then we can have a look at it. So I already opened the tech community article, which you can see here. So this
this
really
animated GIF, Christian. This is
that's the highlight of the article.
Yeah.
Did you wrote a test for that?
I couldn't read the article because I only look at this animated GIF. But
it's just showcasing a frustrated customer.
Yeah. Okay.
If you don't write any tests for your application. So the idea of the article is mainly came up because within the tech community, we have also seen that there were more and more posts coming up asking, how can I set up Cypress, my Cumulocity application, in order to write end-to-end tests? So as we are using Cypress for our own project, we just wanted to share some knowledge, and that's the reason why I've written this article. And also at the same time, I wanted to highlight the package from Thomas, so that it also gets a bit more visibility, and that also external people know about this package and that they can use this package in order to write end-to-end tests for the application. And the structure of the article is pretty straightforward. So for the whole article, I'm using a UI plugin which I've developed, which is a Favorites Manager plugin, as a reference to provide some use cases and examples. I will also show this in a couple of seconds. And then it's basically guiding you through the steps on how to set up Cypress and also how to set up Thomas Cypress package. So kind of a recipe on how to set up your whole test environment, and then it's directly diving into writing your first Cypress test. And as mentioned, so it's based on the Favorites Manager plugin, which I have also referenced the GitHub repository in the article. I can quickly show you what the Favorites Manager plugin is about. So this is now running on my local machine. You can see here there's a new menu entry, which basically gives you a list of your favorites. So basically you can favorite or favor an asset, a device or group within your application, and then it becomes part of this list, and then you can basically
kind of
quickly
quick
access
navigation, the most used devices, groups you're using.
Exactly. So for example, if I go now to the sample group, I can add it as a favorite. Same, for example, for this asset, software AG HQ, can add it as a favorite, and then you can see it becomes part of the favorites list. And then I can also do some filtering here if I want to filter out specific assets by type, whatever. I also can add devices, and basically gives me a quick access to my, for example, most important assets. And I thought that I want to use this UI plugin because it provides some convenient test scenarios, which are easy to implement, and at the same time also explains the base principles of end-to-end testing using Cypress and Thomas package. And that's the reason why I've chosen this plugin. And let me go to the project. Where is it? So this is now the project, which you can also find here on the GitHub repository, and you can see it's already configured using Cypress. So meaning that we have also dependencies which are required. So here we have the dev dependencies to Cypress, but also to the Cumulocity Cypress package, along with the configuration already set up. So you can see here it's not pointing to any Cumulocity tenant, but instead it's pointing to the local host. So this means that I need to run the application on my local machine in order for Cypress to connect to it properly. But you could also, for example, if you have your application or your plugin deployed to any Cumulocity instance, you can also reference here the Cumulocity instance as a base URL, and then Cypress would execute the test end-to-end test to this particular instance. But for testing purposes, I'm now routing it to a local host that I can test everything on my local machine. This is also especially handy if I want to update my components or modules based on some test feedback. So then I can do it directly on my local environment and then run the test again, see, okay, if everything works now properly. Along the configuration for Cypress, we also have here a Cypress environment file. This is now for the Cypress package from Cumulocity, where I can then configure, for example, environment variables, which are then used by the package itself. You can see I've already configured here tenant username password. So the password is something I will then fill in. And this is especially useful if you want to create a session later on in the test, because the Cypress package, Cumulocity Cypress package, automatically uses these environment variables in order to generate the session for you. That's also something.
So main idea of driving basically everything via environment variables is CI/CD. So you can basically tell your tests whatever you need to do, right? Base URLs and credentials and different credentials. Via your test pipeline. So this is very important.
Yeah. So what I will do now is just run this comment. So this is part of the package.json. You can see here if I scroll up that we have a comment for running Cypress. And open means that it basically opens a browser in which you then can execute the tests. So if I click on this one, start and connect to a local host. Oops. And here you can see that we can select whether we want to run end-to-end tests or component testing. So component testing is not configured as part of this project, but something we will discuss a bit later. So for end-to-end testing, we can then select what kind of browser you want to test your app. I will just keep Chrome, and then you can see it starts a new instance of Chrome, and then lists all your tests which are available. And then if I click on the test suite for favorite manager, you can see that Cypress imports the test and then executes the test. And then we get a detailed list of all the comments which Cypress runs, and also logs like what kind of requests have been received, what kind of selectors have been used. So here on the right side, you can also see kind of a preview what Cypress is actually doing. It's really fast because automatic text execution.
And what kind of test did you have implemented?
I've implemented as part of the favorites manager 2 tests. If I go back to test overview, you can see here. So 2 tests. And maybe before I go into the details of the different tests, normally how I structure a test in Cypress is that I have a before and before each block, where, for example, here in the before block, you set everything up which is basically global to your test suite. And in the before each block, you then run code which is then targeted to each individual test, which is part of your test suite. And what I do here in my before block is I don't want to use any existing user in my tenant to run the test for, but instead I create a temporary user to have kind of a clean test environment for this particular user. So because I want to make sure if I run my test later on and want to, for example, favor a specific asset, that this particular user doesn't have any favorites yet. So I want to always start on a from scratch or with an empty favorites list, let's say it this way. And in order for doing this, what I do is I use my admin user, which I've configured here in the Cypress environment, to connect to Cumulocity. You can see here I already use comments from the Cumulocity Cypress package, like the get off and login. So this is basically to create a session in Cumulocity. Here I'm using my admin user. This is done implicitly by the package because I've configured as using environment variable. So if I call guess auth login, we will first look at the environment variables and see, okay, I've configured the tenant, username, password, and therefore it will take this in order to create the authentication and the session. And then afterwards, again, I use a comment from the Cumulocity package in order to create a new user. So this simple comment, what it does is basically creating a new user in your Cumulocity environment. Here you can see, so I've provided a username, password, display name, and email, and also providing roles which the user should have. And by just having executed this simple comment, the Cumulocity Cypress package creates me the new user in Cumulocity and also at the same time assigns the roles to this temporary user. And now you can think of if you would implement this by yourself, it would be a lot of code
requests. Actually.
And this is what I meant earlier, and this is one of the main benefits of using Cumulocity Cypress package. You get these comments already delivered by the package, and you don't need to implement these by yourself, and therefore basically reduce the amount of time which you need in order to implement Cumulocity end-to-end tests. And after creating this user, then before I execute each test, I simply use this user in order to sign in so that the test gets executed in the context of this user.
And then the famous high cookie banner.
And the test itself, what they do is, so I have two tests as part of this test suite. The first one is pretty simple. I start at the home or at the initial homepage of Cumulocity cockpit application and then click on the favorites or first check if the favorites menu item exists in the navigator. If it's the case, I click on it and check if the favorites list is being displayed to the user. That's what the first test is about. And this is also what you can see here. So we have here again a comment from the Cumulocity Cypress package, which is basically that you can provide an URL, a language, and a selector. What this comment does is it will navigate to this URL based on this language and will wait as long as this selector becomes accessible or is visible and exists.
Yeah, so this is important as Cumulocity takes some time to load, right? So, and you really want to make sure that your tests start running once it's really done loading. So this is sometimes a little bit challenging, and this was an approach we added at the very beginning.
Exactly, and then it's basically what I just show manually that I look up the favorites menu item, click on it, and then check if the favorites manager exists. And you can also see here that we kind of mix how we select different elements in the DOM. Here I'm basically using the selector of my Angular component because it's Unix, so therefore I can directly use it. And at the same time, and this is kind of a best practice that for different kind of components or elements in your DOM that you provide this kind of data CY attribute, which then can be used as kind of a selector. So you can see here that the navigator out of the box provides this data CY attribute with here's a label of favorites. And this makes it really easy for me to select the correct menu item or the menu item I want to select from the navigator. Otherwise, if I wouldn't have this kind of attribute available here, I would need to run through the whole list of menu items and check, for example, based on the label.
Which one is the favorites one?
Which one is the favorites? And instead of doing this, I can simply use this data CY attribute in order to have kind of a quick access via the selector.
That's also a Cypress best practice documented by Cypress, and that's maybe also something to highlight. So Cypress does have a very, very, very good doc and a huge community. So you will find all this kind of information. Once you start looking into Cypress, there's actually no way not to find this kind of information. It's really a lot that they're providing, and also with a lot of details and explanation. So this is very, very easy to get started and to find basically all this kind of information.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the second test is a bit more complex to also introduce some other concepts from Cypress. And this is basically about how you would favor an asset or group. So basically that it will look up an asset and then check if the action is available in the action bar for this asset. And then also click on it, check that the state correctly changes based also waiting. As you can see, there was a brief loading indicator because the component also sends a backend request to store the list of favorites or this particular favorite in the user object. And this is also something which I then later on test in my Cypress test, that I can see, okay, once I've clicked on this action, is the correct request being sent out? Does it return the correct response status code? And then once I favored my asset, then I check, okay, is the asset part of the list? It is. Then I click on it and remove it again from my favorites and go back to my favorites list. And here in this case, it's not the case, but normally then it would be empty for my new user because we also only favored one asset. So yeah, and this is basically what the test also here is about. So reusing the same principles or best practices using data CY attribute in order to identify elements in the DOM. And then, for example, here we use, for example, the intercept comment from Cypress to intercept or listen to a specific request we are interested in. So in this case, it's the update of the current user object. And this is what you can see here. So I here specify the interceptor. Then I look up the action button for my asset, which I've navigated to based here on the visit. And then I click on it, and you can see here, once the test has clicked on it, I use the interceptor to wait whether the status code for this particular request is equal to 200. And then,
that's a good wait, by the way. So I've been talking about, if you run into the situation to wait for something, you might have done something wrong, but this is actually intended because here you wait for a REST request. And this is something that helps you really get your tests a lot more stable and reliable, as you don't run into any timeouts. And basically every time you have an REST interaction, you should do also some sort of wait, because you don't know, does it take like a second or like 30 seconds? Sometimes if you run in CI/CD in some shared environments, like REST requests might take a lot longer than default timeouts. And here with this waits, you can better control how long to also wait, what timeout to use for the specific wait for REST request, but not assume that it always just runs as fast as running Cumulocity locally or your application locally in ideal scenario.
Yeah, this is right. So basically a lot of requests which are sent out by a component are asynchronous. So it means that at some point you want to wait or want to know when the request has been finished. And that's why you use also wait here at this point, because when I click on the button, the request is being sent out, and after the request was successful, indicated by the status code, I then check whether the state of the button has correctly changed. So it doesn't display anymore add to favorites, but instead then remove from favorites. And this is then...
I have to, because we have to look on the time. We are already over time. I think this is open source, right? I think it was pretty awesome to see as a very good example how you can implement your own Cypress test and how to use actually the package and the framework you have written, Thomas. To sum this meeting or the tech talk up, are there any further next steps you're planning to improve either the package, or you're planning to write another article or publish something else? What are your improvements? What do you want to make? What are your next steps for you? How do you want to proceed further with this?
Well, actually, we're quite heavily working on this package, but probably in a little different way of what we've shown now. So basically the custom commands that Christian is using. But as Christian also said, we are using, as R&D, we are also using this tool for our own tests. And what I started and what's also available in the package already is capabilities for API testing. So we also want to write our integration tests using Cypress, because we now have a lot of Cypress know-how. We don't want to use a different tool for writing just API tests, and it does have some great capabilities already using.
So not only web app development, that's plain API tests and similar to what Christian just showed, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so the out-of-the-box API testing capabilities from Cypress, they're there, and you can probably do something. But it's a lot of code. You have to construct all the requests manually. It's a lot of deeply nested code. It's not nice. So very basic support. But I've also added documentation of how to do this. So don't go into too much detail right now. But like API testing is a huge thing we're working on. As well as component testing. That's currently one of our main focuses. We want to basically switch from the overall E2E tests into what Christian said, this blurry thing in between unit tests and E2E tests. We want to have component tests, so you don't need to test Cumulocity in order to test the plugin that Christian created, but just mount the plugin, provide some configuration options, do the tests, and done. So without any loading. So ideally everything offline. So we are also investing a lot of time into making our tests offline available, because what we found is basically a lot of the time our test suites run is actually loading of Cumulocity, and so test suites or test frameworks like Cypress come with the concept of test isolation. So what this means is that basically every test case starts its own context. So it's not that in a before each you load Cumulocity and then you do your testing in the loaded in the loaded state of the web application, but instead you would create and load the Cumulocity for every single test. And the more tests you have, the more time it takes. And so we are investing a lot of time into making things offline available, which we do anyways with mocking and you will definitely come to a point where you do mocking in your tests. And this is what we want to make easier. And component tests, just as a spoiler, we want to make available completely offline. And then it's like really running your tests in like a couple seconds so it will take longer to start Cypress with component testing, because it doesn't need to only load Cypress, it also needs to load Angular and the Angular components into the browser. So it might take a little bit of time, but then the tests are just done within almost no time. And this is a really great feature, and this is also one of the reasons why we looked into Cypress, so we can do E2E and component testing. And what we're also looking into is how can we, with all the plugins that we now work on, how can we what kind of features we can provide in this testing frameworks to basically test your plugin and the compatibility with the shell, so Cockpit, for example. So you might need different versions of the shell and different versions of the plugin, so those kind of things. And so that's where we are.
A lot of
what
stuff
we are targeting. Yeah, so there's a lot actually to come, as this is also a huge topic for us currently.
Yeah, and I think
we're making everything available.
And coming back to your original question, Stefan, I think so there will be a next article being written. And I think this article will focus on the topic Thomas just described about component testing using Cypress in Cumulocity.
Yeah, this is a really huge thing, I think. So especially if you didn't start with Cypress and E2E tests, component tests might be really something to look into. Just as an intermediate step, and then E2E testing, coming back to your initial question, so it's the easiest way to get some test coverage and test all the components at once.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to test different states of the components because you need to configure your application in a way so the component appears in a certain state. But with component testing, you can just create yourself 10, 20, 30 different configurations for your component, check if it does what you want it to do, and you're done. So you don't need to load, no session, no navigation. You just load your component, check it's showing correctly, and you're done. And this is something that will really add a lot of quality to your product, and then and will reduce the amount of tests you write and you need to write in the E2E tests, because most of this you will cover in the component test already, and in the E2Es you will just check if the overall workflows are correct. You don't need to care about details that you covered in a component test. You wouldn't do then in an E2E test. This is basically also where we see our future of testing then.
Yeah, sounds great. Great, guys. We are already over time. It was really nice to
sorry,
have you.
everyone.
No,
as expected.
As expected. It was totally interesting.
We didn't even start yet, right? But
yeah, 1 hour already. Yeah, it's fine. It was a pleasure having you. Maybe we do another talk about the component test when it's ready. I would love to do so. Again, great that that you joined my tech talk. Let's have another tech talk when the component.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
All right. Bye.